They thought the storm would bury her. A police officer left broken in the snow, betrayed by those sworn to protect. A single father and his German shepherd, Milo, found her when no one else dared. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in loyalty, if you believe family can be found in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The winter storm had come earlier than anyone in Brattleboro, Vermont expected. The town, tucked between rolling hills and thick pine woods, was buried under sheets of white. The air was sharp with the smell of frozen earth and wood smoke, and the silence that hung over the land was so heavy that even the howl of the wind felt muffled, swallowed by the snow. On nights like this, the town looked less like a community of families and more like a ghost village clinging to the edge of the wilderness. Ethan Miller tightened his scarf as he stepped outside. He was 42 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man trained never to let his guard down. Years ago, he had served as a rescue medic in the Marines, and though he'd traded uniforms for flannel shirts and denim jeans, his bearing still carried the echo of discipline and vigilance. His dark hair was flecked with early gray, and his blue eyes held a mixture of caution and weariness, the look of someone who had lost much and carried on anyway. Ethan was a single father, a widower for 3 years now, raising his son alone on a small ranch on the outskirts of Brattleboro. He walked with the kind of steady patience that comes only from carrying responsibility every day. Beside him bounded Milo, his German shepherd. Milo was 7 years old, a large male with thick black and tan fur that looked almost golden under moonlight. His left ear drooped slightly, a quirk from an old injury. Across his right side, a faint scar marked where another life had once hurt him. But what struck most people was his eyes, amber, intelligent, watchful, as though he carried secrets too heavy for words. Ethan hadn't chosen the name Milo at random. Years ago, when his wife Melissa was still alive, they had struggled to name the puppy they rescued from an overcrowded shelter. The little boy Caleb, only 3 at the time, had whispered Milo after a character in his favorite picture book. Melissa had laughed through her illness and said the name meant soldier and merciful in some old languages. It had stuck, and through the years the dog had become more than a companion. He was the silent guardian of the Miller household, their soldier of mercy. The storm rattled the wooden boards of the porch. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and whistled softly. "Come on, Milo. Let's do one more round before it gets worse." He carried a heavy flashlight, its beam slicing through swirling snowflakes. Back inside the house, 8-year-old Caleb Miller leaned against the upstairs window. Caleb was small for his age, with sandy blonde hair that stuck up in cowlicks and big gray eyes that mirrored his father's but with more innocence. He wore loose pajamas patterned with comic book heroes, the fabric a little faded from too many wash cycles. Caleb was an imaginative, restless boy, still carrying the ache of losing his mother, though he rarely spoke of it. He clung fiercely to Ethan and to Milo, as if both were anchors keeping him from drifting into loneliness. Watching the storm made his chest feel tight, but he always felt safer when Milo was near. The wind howled across the field. Ethan trudged forward, Milo padding ahead, nose low to the ground. They circled the boundary fence, snow crunching under boots and paws. Ethan's thoughts wandered as they often did on long winter nights toward Melissa, her final winter crocheting blankets near the fire, her laughter filling the small cabin, her absence still raw in every corner. He had never imagined raising Caleb alone. The storm seemed to carry her voice, faint and gone. Suddenly Milo froze. His ears shot forward, hackles rising, body tense like a drawn bow. A deep growl vibrated through his chest. Ethan stopped, heart rate spiking. He had learned to trust Milo's instincts. The dog never stiffened without reason. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, sweeping the flashlight beam across the snow. The swirling white parted just enough to reveal something unnatural, a dark shape twisted at the base of the tree line near Old Creek Bridge. Milo barked furiously, lunging forward. Ethan followed, boots sinking deep in the drifts. As he drew closer, his stomach lurched. A police cruiser lay overturned, half buried in snow, its emergency lights weakly flashing red and blue against the storm. The metal was mangled, glass shattered, the world painted in crimson streaks across white. Inside, a figure dangled motionless from a seatbelt. Ethan scrambled forward, his breath fogging the air. "Dear God." It was a woman. Her uniform was soaked, her dark hair plastered to her face, her skin the color of ivory, lips tinged with dangerous blue. Blood matted the side of her forehead. She stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering open with immense effort. Her voice came out in a rasp, words trembling in the frozen air. "Officer, Olivia Hayes, badge 247." And then her eyes rolled back, her body limp again. Ethan's hands moved automatically, training and instinct kicking in. He shoved at the crumpled door. Metal screamed against metal, but it gave enough for him to reach her. Milo barked and circled, nose twitching as though sensing more than just the wreck. The dog's gaze cut sharply to the woods behind them, amber eyes wide with warning. "Not now, Milo," Ethan muttered, though his own instincts screamed that something was wrong. The air itself felt too quiet, as if someone unseen watched from the trees. But Olivia's shallow breathing demanded action. He unclipped her seatbelt and pulled her free. She was lighter than he expected, but her body sagged with the dead weight of unconsciousness. He lifted her against his shoulder, careful not to jar her head. Milo pressed close to his leg, growling low, ears pinned back. Snow stung Ethan's face as he began the trek home, boots sinking deep into drifts. Each step felt endless. Olivia's breath puffed weakly against his chest. Through the curtain of snow, Ethan saw the warm yellow glow of their ranch house, standing firm against the storm like a beacon. He pushed harder, lungs burning, every instinct demanding he get her to safety. Milo ran ahead, then circled back, scanning the darkness with restless vigilance. Back inside, Caleb had seen the faint glow of the cruiser's lights through his window. The boy's eyes widened, his small hand pressed against the glass. Something was happening out there in the blizzard, something that made his stomach twist with fear and curiosity. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, whispering to himself, "Come back soon, Dad. Come back with Milo." The wind slammed against the wooden walls of the Miller ranch house as Ethan carried the unconscious officer inside. He pushed the door shut with his shoulder, snow spilling across the entryway, while Milo darted ahead and stationed himself near the front window. The dog's fur bristled, amber eyes locked on the forest outside, a low growl humming in his chest as though he knew something in the darkness did not belong. Ethan laid the woman carefully on the worn leather sofa near the fireplace. The flames had burned low, but the embers glowed enough to push warmth back into the frozen air. He draped one of the heavy wool blankets across her body, tucking it beneath her chin. Her uniform was stiff with half-frozen blood, her badge glinting faintly under the light of the fire. For the first time since finding her, Ethan could see her face clearly. She was younger than he expected, maybe in her early 30s. Olivia Hayes had high cheekbones, a straight nose, and lips cracked from the cold. Her dark hair fell in messy strands across her forehead, matted with blood. Even in unconsciousness, her brow carried a furrow of tension, as though she had been bracing against more than the storm. From the stairs above came the creak of small feet. Caleb had not been able to contain his curiosity. The boy's eyes were wide, his thin frame wrapped in his superhero pajamas. He clutched the wooden railing with one hand and descended slowly, each step hesitant, as though worried his father might send him back to bed. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, sighing softly. "Caleb, it's late." "But Dad," the boy whispered, "who is she? And why is Milo acting like that?" Caleb's voice held both awe and fear. He had grown up with Milo as a gentle giant, a protector who curled beside his bed on stormy nights. Seeing the dog stiff, tail rigid, body trembling with suppressed growls was unsettling. Milo glanced briefly at Caleb, ears twitching, then returned his focus to the window, nose pressed against the glass as snow battered outside. "She's hurt," Ethan answered quietly, kneeling to check Olivia's pulse. The rhythm was faint but steady. "That's all you need to know right now." "Go grab the first aid kit," Caleb obeyed, disappearing into the hallway. As Ethan worked, he became aware of Olivia's shallow breaths evening out, her chest rising with more strength than before. He carefully cleaned the gash on her forehead, his hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at him. His training as a combat medic had never truly left him. He noticed then the faint scent of her perfume under the copper tang of blood and the sharp smell of antiseptic, something floral, delicate, and strangely at odds with her battered uniform. The crackling of the fire drew his eyes upward. On the mantel sat a row of family photographs. Himself in uniform years ago, Melissa holding baby Caleb in her arms, Caleb's first day of school, and one picture Ethan could never bring himself to move. A candid shot of Melissa sitting on the porch, sunlight painting her golden hair, her eyes alight with laughter. Beside it stood the small, crocheted blanket she had made in her final winter, folded neatly, never used. Olivia's gaze flickered open just then, and the first thing her eyes landed on was the photograph. She blinked hard, tears threatening at the corners, not for herself, but for the familiarity of grief. Even through pain, she recognized loss when she saw it. Caleb returned with the first aid kit, setting it down beside his father. "She doesn't look scary," the boy said softly, almost to himself. Ethan smiled faintly despite the gravity of the moment. "She isn't. She's just someone who needs help." He tousled his son's hair, then turned his attention back to the officer. Olivia stirred, her lips moving soundlessly before she whispered, "Where?" Ethan leaned closer. "You're safe. You had an accident. I'm Ethan Miller. This is my home." Her eyes, glazed and unfocused, shifted toward Caleb, then to Milo, who had not moved from his vigil. Her voice was hoarse. "The dog. He knows." Ethan frowned but said nothing. He was about to ask what she meant when a sharp knock rattled the back of the house. He stiffened instantly, every muscle tensing. Caleb gasped and clutched his father's sleeve. Milo erupted into fierce barking, teeth bared, body lunging against the doorframe. Ethan quickly motioned for silence, moving to the back. When he opened the door, only the wind rushed in, carrying snow that dusted the wooden floor. Whoever or whatever had knocked was gone. Returning to the living room, Ethan found Olivia's eyes half open, watching him with an intensity that belied her weakness. She had seen his reaction, his readiness to fight. "You're military," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Ethan hesitated, then nodded once. "Used to be." A lifetime ago, Olivia's eyes closed again, but her hand reached blindly until it brushed against the crocheted blanket on the back of the couch. She grasped it weakly, her fingers curling into the yarn. "She made this," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking, though she couldn't have known Melissa's story. Ethan's throat tightened, but he said nothing. It was enough that she had recognized what only another soul acquainted with loss could. Caleb had curled onto the rug by the fire, Milo pressed close beside him. The boy leaned against the dog's warm body, whispering, "Protect her, Milo." The German shepherd's ears twitched, his growl fading into a steady hum of vigilance. His name, chosen years ago in a moment of innocence, carried its meaning in that instant more than ever. Soldier, merciful guardian. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew fiercer, the windows rattling under the weight of the wind. Inside the cabin, a fragile calm settled. Ethan sat in the armchair across from the couch, watching the stranger who had suddenly entered their lives. Olivia Hayes, whoever she truly was no longer just a wounded officer. She was a puzzle, her arrival tangled in something larger than a simple accident. But for now, in the warmth of the firelight, surrounded by echoes of the past and the silent loyalty of Milo, she was simply a human being clinging to life in the middle of a storm. Morning broke reluctantly over Brattleboro, the storm clouds thinning just enough to let a pale light spill across the snow-laden fields. The Miller cabin creaked in protest against the cold, its windows rimmed with frost. Ethan had not slept. Instead, he sat at the dining table with a steaming mug of black coffee, his eyes drifting constantly toward the sofa where Olivia Hayes lay. Milo rested on the rug nearby, head on his paws, but his amber eyes never strayed far from the injured officer. Olivia stirred at last, her lashes fluttering as consciousness pulled her back. She winced, hand reaching instinctively for the bandaged wound at her temple. Ethan leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "You're safe. You're in my home. I'm Ethan Miller, and that over there is Caleb, my boy." Caleb peeked from the stairwell, his hair a tousled halo of gold, curiosity burning in his gray eyes. Olivia slowly sat upright, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Olivia Hayes," she said at length, her voice rough but steadier than before. "Badge number 247, Brattleboro Police Department." She paused as if repeating the details was her way of grounding herself, tethering to reality. Ethan nodded, accepting the formal introduction, but waited for her to explain more. She didn't. Instead, she cast her gaze toward the fire, avoiding the subject of her wreck entirely. Caleb tiptoed closer, his thin frame wrapped in a blanket like a cloak. He studied her with unabashed frankness, then asked with childlike honesty, "Are you going to be my new mom?" The words startled the room into silence. Ethan's face flushed as he half rose, about to scold, but Olivia's expression softened instead of hardening. A flicker of pain crossed her eyes, then an almost wistful smile. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm just someone passing through." But the way her eyes lingered on Ethan betrayed that the question had cut deeper than she expected. Milo rose suddenly, padding to Olivia's side. He sniffed her hand, then pressed his great head against her leg with a familiarity that shocked Ethan. The German shepherd, usually cautious around strangers, especially those in uniform, behaved as if he'd known her forever. Olivia froze, staring down at the animal, her fingers trembling as they hovered above his fur. Finally, she let her hand rest against his side, brushing the thick coat where a faint scar ran along his rib cage. Her breath hitched. "This mark," she murmured. Ethan tilted his head, curious. "He came with it when we adopted him. Never knew what caused it. Shelter folks said he'd been through a rough time before us." Olivia traced the scar lightly, her expression unreadable. Then she lifted her gaze to Milo's amber eyes, and for a moment her composure cracked. The dog's stare was unblinking, piercing, filled with something almost human recognition, grief, loyalty. Ethan felt the shift in the air, the weight of unspoken history pressing between woman and dog. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, tinged with suspicion. Olivia shook her head quickly. "Nothing. Just, I used to have a dog like him once." Her words were too fast, too rehearsed, but Ethan let it pass, though his instincts told him there was more beneath the surface. The cabin door rattled then, the sound of someone knocking snow off their boots before stepping onto the porch. Ethan stiffened, rising silently. Caleb's eyes widened as he hurried back to the stairs. Milo bolted toward the door, teeth bared, growling low. Ethan opened it cautiously to reveal Nora Whitfield, their neighbor. Nora was in her 50s, a sturdy woman with weathered skin and cheeks reddened by cold. She carried a wicker basket wrapped in a checkered cloth. Her eyes, a sharp hazel, missed little. Widowed for more than a decade, she had taken to looking out for everyone on their stretch of road. The loss of her husband in a logging accident had made her fiercely independent, and though she wore her grief quietly, it showed in the lines etched deep around her eyes. "Storm's got the whole town worried," she said briskly, stamping snow from her boots. "Thought you might need some bread. And extra blankets. Caleb mentioned something about company?" Ethan forced a smile, but his jaw tightened at Caleb's loose tongue. "Thanks, Nora. You didn't have to." He accepted the basket, careful to block her view inside. But Nora was not easily dissuaded. She leaned slightly, catching sight of Olivia on the sofa. "Well now, you've got yourself an unexpected guest." Her tone was neutral, but her raised brow spoke volumes. Ethan said evenly, "Officer Hayes had an accident. She's resting here until she's well enough to leave." Nora's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "All right then. I'll keep my nose out of it, but you holler if you need anything." She glanced at Milo, who stood planted firmly between her and Olivia, a growl still rumbling. "That dog of yours always did have sharp instincts," Nora remarked. She left soon after, her boots crunching over the frozen yard. Back inside, Ethan set the basket down and turned back to Olivia. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clenched in the blanket. "You don't trust her?" he asked. Olivia shook her head. "It's not her. It's everything." Her eyes darted back to Milo, who had returned to her side as though guarding her specifically. Later, as Caleb helped arrange the bread on the table, he whispered to Milo, "You really like her, huh?" The dog licked his cheek in answer, but when Olivia reached out again, Milo met her eyes in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. She whispered so quietly Ethan barely heard, "You remember, don't you?" Ethan's brow furrowed. He wanted to demand an explanation, but something in Olivia's trembling hands told him now wasn't the time. Still, his unease deepened. He had rescued strangers before, carried men from battlefields, but never had he seen Milo act as though he had found someone he had been waiting for. The storm outside began to ease, moonlight piercing through ragged clouds, glinting off the snow. In the flicker of firelight, Ethan studied Olivia carefully. She was hiding something. He could feel it. And Milo knew it too. His eyes said so, even if his voice could not. The snowstorm had weakened by mid-morning, leaving Brattleboro cloaked in heavy drifts that reflected a dull gray sky. The main street of town looked deceptively calm, shops with frosted windows, plowed sidewalks lined with slush, and neighbors bundled in layers of wool talking quietly as they shoveled. But beneath the stillness, rumors were beginning to spread like cracks beneath ice. In the police station, whispers floated between officers who avoided eye contact. The name Sheriff Frank Donovan surfaced in low tones, each voice carrying caution. Donovan was a man in his late 50s, tall, barrel-chested, with thinning gray hair and a commanding presence that had once inspired confidence. His square jaw and booming voice made him a natural authority figure, but over the years, his gaze had hardened, his smile sharpened into something less genuine. On duty, he carried himself as a father of the town, shaking hands at community fairs, visiting schools with speeches about law and order. But those who knew him privately often spoke of the temper that simmered just beneath the surface, and now, with rumors tying him to a drug smuggling ring running through Vermont's back roads, the carefully crafted image was beginning to fracture. Olivia knew too much. That was why she had ended up bleeding in the snow. She sat at Ethan's kitchen table now, pale but alert, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She glanced at Milo, stationed loyally at her feet, then back at Ethan. "The accident wasn't an accident," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. "They wanted me dead before I could speak." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his broad chest. His military training made him steady, but his jaw tightened at her words. "And by they, you mean Donovan?" Olivia's eyes flicked toward the frost-covered window. "Donovan runs deeper than people think. He's not just turning a blind eye, he's orchestrating shipments. I've been collecting evidence for months. Last night I was supposed to deliver a drive to an FBI contact. I never made it." Milo shifted at her feet, pressing his muzzle against her leg as if sensing her fear. Caleb, sitting nearby with a plate of toast, perked up at the word evidence. He looked between his father and Olivia with wide eyes. "So you're really a hero, aren't you?" he blurted out. Olivia smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Heroes are just people who survive long enough to do the right thing," she said. That afternoon, Caleb returned to school, his mind still racing. At recess, while the children huddled in puffy coats and boots, he couldn't resist sharing what he had witnessed. To his best friend Tommy Green, a freckle-faced boy with an oversized parka and a habit of blurting things before thinking, Caleb whispered, "We've got a real police officer staying with us. Dad and Milo are protecting her. She's a hero." Tommy's eyes widened with excitement, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Really? Like in the movies?" Caleb nodded earnestly, forgetting his father's warnings about secrecy. Nearby, Mrs. Janine Cooper, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who worked as a part-time librarian and had a reputation for being the town's gossip, overheard just enough of the conversation. Janine was tall and lean, with glasses perched perpetually at the end of her nose and a scarf knotted tightly around her neck. She had lived in Brattleboro her whole life and knew everyone's business, whether they wanted her to or not. Widowed young, she had filled her loneliness with chatter, often embellishing truths into stories. Now, her ears pricked at Caleb's words. A police officer hiding at Ethan Miller's house? That was too curious to ignore. By the time Caleb walked home that afternoon, Janine had already passed along her suspicions to two neighbors at the general store, her voice lowered, but eyes gleaming with the thrill of potential scandal. "Something's happening out at the Miller place," she said, "and it's not just about that dog of his." Back at the ranch, Ethan noticed Caleb unusually quiet as he removed his boots by the door. "Everything okay at school?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but probing. Caleb hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, just stuff." Milo patted over, nudging the boy's hand, as though encouraging honesty. Caleb swallowed hard, guilt written across his young face. Ethan let it slide for now, though he had learned long ago that silence often said more than words. Olivia, sitting once again by the fire with a blanket over her shoulders, caught Ethan's eye. "You can't keep this a secret forever. If Donovan suspects I'm here, he'll come looking." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Then let him come. This house has seen worse storms than him." His voice carried the weight of truth, but Olivia knew the danger was not something that could be outlasted by stubbornness alone. That night, as the wind howled again through the eaves, Ethan stood at the window, staring toward the dark line of the woods. Milo sat beside him, ears perked, body tense. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" Ethan murmured. Milo gave a low growl, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. In those eyes, Ethan thought he saw more than instinct. He saw understanding, and perhaps even the same dread that coiled in his own chest. The days following Olivia's confession seemed quieter on the surface, but Ethan felt the unease deepening in the air around the ranch. Brattleboro looked peaceful under its blanket of snow, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of distant plows cutting through frozen streets. Yet to Ethan, a man who had once survived ambushes in deserts and jungles, silence was often the most dangerous sound. On a frigid morning, he noticed at first tracks that didn't belong. Ethan was a hunter in the practical sense, trained to read landscapes, and he knew the difference between the paw prints of foxes and coyotes and the heavier depressions left by boots. These prints weren't his, nor Caleb's. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods toward the far side of his property. Milo picked up on them instantly, his fur bristling, ears pinned back, barking with sharp intensity that echoed across the snowfield. Ethan crouched beside the prints, his breath visible in the cold, his gut clenched. Whoever had been here had come close, too close. He rose slowly, glancing at Milo, who was already pulling toward the tree line, nose pressed into the wind. "Easy, boy," Ethan muttered, but he allowed the dog to lead. Together they followed the trail until it vanished into the dense pines where shadows swallowed the snow. Ethan's military instincts flared, scanning every movement in the undergrowth, his hand unconsciously brushing the old knife strapped to his belt. But the intruder was gone. When they returned to the cabin, Olivia was waiting near the window. She had a way of standing still that revealed her training, the way her hand hovered near her hip as if expecting to reach for her weapon at any moment. Her dark hair had been pulled back now, her pale skin still bruised from the accident. "Someone's been here, haven't they?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer right away, but his silence was confirmation enough. That night, with the fire casting flickering shadows, Olivia finally revealed what she had been holding back. She sat at the dining table, her hands clasped around a small object she had hidden in her jacket since the crash. She placed it on the table between them, a black USB drive, scratched but intact. "This," she said softly, "is the reason Donovan wants me gone." It holds financial records, shipment schedules, names, enough to bring down half his network. Ethan stared at it, the weight of the truth settling on his shoulders. Caleb, who had been sitting on the stairs pretending to read a comic book, leaned closer without making a sound. His wide eyes darted between his father, Olivia, and the small piece of plastic that seemed to carry the fate of their town. He didn't understand all the details, but he knew it was important. Ethan rubbed his temples. "You realize what you've brought into my home? This isn't just evidence, it's a target. And now, my boy—" He stopped, shaking his head. Olivia's expression tightened, guilt flashing across her face. "I didn't choose for you to be dragged into this. But if Donovan's men think I'm dead, it buys us time. We just have to be careful." Milo lifted his head from beside Caleb, ears twitching. He walked over to Olivia, resting his muzzle on her knee again. That strange familiarity passed between them, the unspoken recognition. Olivia stroked his fur absently, her fingers brushing the scar along his rib. "He knows," she whispered almost to herself. Ethan caught it this time, his eyes narrowing, but before he could press further, Caleb's small voice broke the tension. "Does that thing mean you're really a hero, like in the movies?" Caleb's tone was innocent, but his timing was poor. Ethan turned sharply, realizing his son had been eavesdropping. "Caleb," he said sternly, "this is grown-up talk. You shouldn't be listening." Caleb flushed, his head dropping, but the curiosity burned in him too brightly. The following day at school, the weight of his secret proved too heavy. Caleb sat at lunch with his neighbor's daughter, Sophie Whitfield, a shy girl with chestnut hair and a habit of biting her nails when nervous. Sophie was 10, taller than Caleb, soft-spoken, and often teased for being quiet. She looked up to Caleb as the braver one, always eager to hear his stories. That afternoon, when she pressed him about the woman staying at his house, Caleb whispered what he had overheard. "She's a police officer, and she's got proof against Donovan. My dad and Milo are protecting her." Sophie's eyes widened, her fork clattering against her tray. "You shouldn't be telling me that," she whispered. But secrets rarely stayed contained, and Sophie's older brother overheard enough to carry the tale home. By evening, the story had begun its slow creep across the neighborhood. Back at the ranch, Ethan felt a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. Milo prowled restlessly, his gaze flicking toward the windows more often than usual. Olivia noticed too, standing near the fire with arms crossed tightly over her chest. "The longer we stay here, the more danger you're in," she said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. He was watching Caleb draw at the kitchen table, Milo curled protectively beside him, the boy unaware of the storm his loose words had just unleashed. The storm returned with vengeance that night, winds howling like wolves across the Vermont hills, shaking the Miller cabin until the wooden beams groaned in protest. Snow whipped against the windows in violent bursts, obscuring the tree line in a white blur. Inside, the fire in the hearth glowed steady, but tension coiled tighter than any winter storm could bring. Ethan had sensed it for hours, the silence between the gusts, the way Milo paced the length of the room, ears straining, hackles high. Something was coming. It began with the crunch of tires on frozen gravel, almost swallowed by the storm. Ethan rose from his chair at once, muscles taut, and peered through the side window. Headlights flickered through the snow, more than one set, approaching with deliberate slowness. "They've found us," he murmured. Olivia, who had been sitting at the table with the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand, stood. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched, but there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. Ethan moved quickly, his training kicking in like an old rhythm. He extinguished the lamps, plunging the cabin into shadow except for the glow of the fire. "Stay low," he ordered. Milo growled deep, pressing his body between Caleb and the door. Caleb, wide-eyed, clutched the old coat of his mother that he had pulled from the closet earlier. He slipped into the pantry cupboard, heart hammering, burying his face in the worn fabric. Melissa's scent had long faded, but to Caleb it still carried the comfort of her embrace. He whispered to himself, "Please, let us be safe." The vehicle stopped outside. Doors slammed. Voices shouted over the wind. Ethan recognized the cadence-armed men, used to moving together. He cursed under his breath. The front door rattled under the first kick. Milo launched into a frenzy of barking, teeth snapping, body straining forward. Through the back window, Ethan saw movement, a figure circling toward the rear. He motioned silently to Olivia. She nodded, crouching low. Ethan grabbed the old shotgun he kept by the door, checked the chamber with practiced precision, and moved to the front. "You ever fired in close quarters?" he whispered. Olivia's lips tightened. "I've handled worse." She drew her sidearm, her hands steady despite the bruises still visible along her temple. The second kick splintered the doorframe. Ethan fired once through the crack. The blast shook the cabin, the intruder's scream torn away by the storm. Milo bolted toward the back where another figure tried forcing the rear entrance. The dog hit the man with explosive force, his jaws clamping down on an arm. The man, a thick-set brute in a ski mask, yelled, swinging wildly, but Milo held fast, dragging him down into the snow. Ethan's instincts sharpened. He moved from shadow to shadow inside the cabin, guiding Olivia. Together they exchanged fire with the men outside, their shots muffled by the storm. Olivia fought beside him with grim determination, her movements crisp, professional. She could have run, but she hadn't. She had chosen to stand with them. Outside, one of Donovan's men barked orders. Rick Halpern, a wiry man in his 40s, known in town as a mechanic with a crooked smile, now revealed in his true colors. His wiry frame was hunched against the wind, his face hidden behind a scarf, but Ethan remembered him from the garage once, eyes too quick, hands too restless. "Bring me the girl," Rick shouted. "Donovan wants her alive." Ethan's stomach twisted. So Donovan hadn't trusted his men to finish the job the first time. He wanted Olivia silenced permanently. Ethan glanced toward her. She met his gaze, breath coming fast, sweat mixing with the soot on her forehead. In that instant, no words were needed. They were bound in survival. Bullets cracked against the wooden walls. Splinters rained. Caleb pressed deeper into the cupboard, clutching Melissa's coat, tears streaking his cheeks as he whispered prayers. He pictured Milo fighting, his father unyielding, Olivia strong, and begged whatever miracle still lingered in the winter night to protect them all. Milo returned inside, his muzzle bloodied but his body unbroken. He stood like a sentinel before the door, barking furiously each time footsteps approached. His amber eyes glowed in the firelight, fierce and unrelenting. Ethan reloaded. Olivia covered him, and together they pushed back each assault. The cabin felt smaller with each blast of gunfire, but it also felt like a Fortress 3 defenders united, refusing to fall. After what felt like an eternity, the storm swallowed the retreating voices. The sound of engines roared, then faded into the night. The silence afterward was deafening. Ethan lowered his shotgun slowly, scanning the yard through the shattered window. The snow was littered with tracks, blood mixing into crimson patches against the white. Olivia sagged against the wall, her pistol still in her grip. Ethan stepped closer, his hand steady on her shoulder. "You could have run," he said softly. She shook her head. "Not while your family was in danger." Her eyes flicked toward the cupboard where Caleb hid. "We're in this together now." Caleb emerged, his small frame trembling, Melissa's coat clutched tightly around him. He ran to his father, burying his face against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped an arm around him, then looked over at Olivia and Milo. For the first time since the storm began, the four of them stood together in the flickering firelight, a soldier, a wounded officer, a child, and a dog bound not by blood, but by choice. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the Miller cabin, a fragile unity had been forged in fire and fear. The storm tapered off by dawn, leaving the Miller ranch buried under a thick white silence. Snowdrifts leaned against the cabin walls like exhausted soldiers, and the air outside glittered with the sharpness of new frost. Inside, the house was heavy with smoke, the scent of gunpowder, and the quiet aftermath of survival. Ethan had not closed his eyes all night. He sat by the window, shotgun resting across his lap, eyes scanning the yard for any movement. Olivia leaned against the far wall, her pistol still close at hand, her dark hair falling in uneven strands, her lips pale but set in determination. Caleb had finally fallen asleep curled on the couch, Melissa's coat pulled tightly around his small frame. Milo lay at his feet, his body stretched out protectively, his breathing uneven. The sound of engines cut through the morning stillness. Ethan stiffened immediately, hand tightening around his weapon, but Olivia lifted her head, her eyes narrowing. "That's not Donovan's men," she whispered. "Listen." The vehicles approached steadily, without the reckless urgency of the attackers. Doors slammed, boots crunched across frozen ground, and then came the commanding voices, measured, practiced, official. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stay inside until cleared." Ethan exhaled slowly, relief battling with suspicion. Milo rose unsteadily, his body tensing, but he did not bark. He seemed to know these men were different. The front door opened after a firm knock, revealing Agent Mark Reynolds, a tall man in his mid-40s with cropped brown hair streaked with silver. His face was weathered by years of long cases and sleepless nights, his hazel eyes sharp and assessing. He wore a heavy black parka over a dark suit, his badge clipped to his belt, and carried the air of someone used to being obeyed. "Olivia Hayes," he called, stepping inside cautiously. Olivia pushed herself to her feet, shoulders squared despite her obvious fatigue. "Agent Reynolds," she said, her voice steady but hoarse. "You got my signal." Mark's gaze softened just slightly. "You had half the Bureau chasing ghosts last night. We tracked it here." His eyes swept across the cabin, noting the bullet holes, the splintered door, the child on the couch, and finally the dog who stood rigid between them. His jaw tightened. "Looks like we weren't a moment too soon." More agents filtered in behind him, men and women in tactical winter gear, moving with efficient precision. One of them, Agent Carla Diaz, a younger woman with olive skin, dark curly hair tucked beneath her hood, and sharp green eyes, set about securing the perimeter. She was lean, quick, and carried herself with the no-nonsense attitude of someone who had worked her way up through grit and discipline. She gave Ethan a curt nod before moving on, her rifle held with practiced ease. Within minutes, reports came crackling over radios, several men subdued in the woods, wounded but alive. And then the news that made Olivia's knees nearly give out. Sheriff Frank Donovan had been captured. Reynolds delivered it with grim satisfaction. He was coordinating the attack. "We've got him. The evidence you've been gathering, combined with your testimony, will bury him." Olivia closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with relief. Months of fear, hiding, and endless watchfulness condensed into that moment. When she opened them again, Milo was at her side. The German shepherd nudged her hand gently with his nose, pressing his head against her leg. It was then Ethan noticed the streak of blood along Milo's shoulder. His heart lurched. "Milo," Ethan breathed, crouching quickly. The dog whined softly, shifting his weight but refusing to move from his post. The wound was not deep, likely a grazing bullet, but it was enough to make Caleb wake with a cry. The boy scrambled off the couch, rushing to his dog's side, tears streaming down his cheeks. "No, you can't leave us." He wrapped his arms tightly around Milo's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. Between sobs, his voice trembled with words that broke Ethan's composure. "I know you were born to protect us." Ethan felt something fracture inside him. He reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, then on Milo's back, feeling the steady thump of the dog's heartbeat. His throat tightened. "He's not just a dog," Ethan whispered, half to Olivia, half to himself. "He's the thread holding us together." Olivia's eyes softened, shimmering with the weight of her own understanding. Reynolds approached quietly, watching the scene. His hardened exterior cracked just slightly as he took in the boy sobbing against the dog, the father kneeling beside them, and the woman whose secrets had nearly cost her life. He cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "We'll get medical attention for the animal, too. He's part of this fight as much as any of us." Outside, the storm had broken completely. Sunlight pierced through the clouds, glittering across untouched snow. Agents led Donovan, handcuffed and scowling, toward their vehicles. The sheriff's once commanding figure now looked small, his reputation shattered. Neighbors peered cautiously from a distance, gossip already blooming, but Ethan paid them no mind. Inside his cabin, surrounded by firelight and fractured walls, something stronger had been built. A fragile family, bound by danger, resilience, and the loyalty of a wounded dog who refused to yield. Spring crept quietly into Vermont, melting away the thick white silence that had gripped Brattleboro for so long. The hills softened with green, streams broke free of their icy prisons, and birdsong returned to fill the mornings. The Miller Ranch, scarred by winter and battle, stood proudly under a gentler sky, its wooden beams repaired, its windows clear once more. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home reborn. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, watching the yard with arms folded, his broad frame relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. The hard lines of a soldier's vigilance had softened, though the discipline in his posture never left entirely. His dark hair caught the gold of morning sunlight, the gray streaks more noticeable now, but his eyes, blue and sharp, held something rare: peace. Olivia Hayes had healed as the seasons turned. The bruises that once marred her face had faded, replaced by a warm vitality that returned slowly but surely. She had resumed wearing her uniform in recent weeks, crisp blues with the badge polished bright, but it was different now. The uniform no longer seemed like armor. It was a choice, a commitment renewed. Her superiors had offered her a transfer, even an office job for her safety, but she declined. Instead, she arranged to be stationed near Brattleboro. The town that had nearly ended her life had also given her something worth staying for. Milo bounded across the yard, his thick black and tan coat glistening with health once again. The wound on his shoulder had healed, leaving only a faint scar among many, but his energy had not dimmed. At 8 years old, he carried himself with the vigor of a dog half his age, tail sweeping the air like a banner. He had resumed his place as guardian of the ranch, but more than that, he was the soul of the household. Wherever Milo went, the others seemed to follow. Caleb chased after him, laughter echoing across the yard. He had grown in the months since the storm, his sandy hair longer, his frame sturdier. Childhood had returned to him, filling the spaces grief had carved out. He wore a light jacket and boots splattered with mud, his cheeks flushed with spring air. He clutched a snowball, what remained of winter's stubborn hold, and hurled it clumsily toward Milo. The dog leapt aside with surprising grace, barked once in delight, then bounded after the boy. Olivia joined them in the yard, laughing as Caleb turned his attention to her. "You can't escape, Officer Hayes," he shouted playfully, launching a snowball that missed her by inches. She dodged with a smirk, her boots crunching against the softening snow, her uniform jacket traded for a simple plaid shirt and jeans. She bent to scoop up her own snowball, tossing it gently back at Caleb, who shrieked with laughter. Milo barked excitedly, darting between them, his eyes bright with joy. Ethan stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. For years, his smiles had been fleeting, shadows of what they once were when Melissa was alive. But now, as he saw Caleb's carefree grin, Olivia's laughter, and Milo's bounding figure, something shifted in him. His chest ached, but not with grief, with gratitude. He smiled fully, deeply, without hesitation. It was the first time in years he allowed himself to believe happiness was possible again. Neighbors had taken notice of the change too. Nora Whitfield, the sturdy widow who had once brought bread and blankets in the storm, now stopped by with baskets of fresh eggs and gentle teasing remarks about how the Miller place finally sounds like a home again. Even Janine Cooper, the town gossip, had softened her tone, her sharp tongue replaced by curiosity tinged with approval. The community, once wary, now saw the Miller cabin as a place of resilience, a house that had survived not just winter, but corruption and fear. Inside, the mantel still held Melissa's photograph, but it was no longer a shrine to sorrow. A new picture had been added beside it. Caleb grinning with Olivia and Milo flanking him, Ethan's hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. Melissa's smile seemed to bless it all from her frame, as though approving the family that had formed in her absence. As the sun climbed higher, the snow gave way to wet grass, the earth rich with promise. Caleb collapsed onto the ground, breathless from laughter, Milo flopping beside him with a huff of contentment. Olivia lay back too, her hair catching the light, her gaze lifting toward the endless blue sky. "Feels like the first day of something," she said softly. Ethan, still on the porch, nodded. "It is." He stepped down into the yard, the mud squelching beneath his boots, and joined them. Caleb scrambled up, throwing his arms around his father's waist, Milo pressing in close, Olivia smiling at the sight. For a long moment, they stood together, a unit forged not by blood, but by choice, by trials endured and loyalties proven. The blizzard that had once threatened to bury them was gone. In its place was spring, and with it, a new dawn. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly in the form of a loyal dog, a child's laughter, or the courage to open our hearts again. Ethan, Olivia, Caleb, and Milo discovered that family is not just blood, but the people and creatures God places in our path to remind us that love still exists. In our everyday lives, we too are given moments to protect, to forgive, and to believe. If God can guide a wounded officer to a single father and his faithful dog in the middle of a storm, then he can guide us through our darkest nights as well. If you believe that miracles are real, if you believe that God's hand can work through even the smallest acts of loyalty and love, then share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below with one word, amen, and let's fill this space with faith. And if you want to keep hearing stories that remind us of God's grace, hit subscribe, because together we can keep spreading light in a world that so often forgets it. May God bless you and your family always.